When a homeless veteran is disrespected, will you stay silent or will you find the courage to speak out in their honor? On a flight that would never be forgotten, Barron Trump made a stand, and the choice he made left the world stunned. The airport terminal buzzed with the familiar chaos of travel. Rolling suitcases clattered against the tiled floor. Announcements crackled over the intercom, and a steady hum of voices filled the air. Passengers hustled through the gate area, balancing coffee cups, boarding passes, and phones. Flight 291 to Seattle was scheduled to depart in less than an hour, and the mood among the travelers was a mix of impatience and anticipation. A gate agent's voice echoed across the terminal, announcing pre-boarding for passengers requiring extra assistance. Near the gate, an older man sat alone, clutching a tattered duffel bag. His clothes were worn and mismatched: faded jeans, a fraying plaid shirt, and a heavy jacket that had seen better days. His boots, scuffed and patched, hinted at years of wear, and a knit cap barely concealed his graying hair. He sat still, his eyes fixed on the floor, as if trying to make himself invisible amidst the bustling crowd. But even in his quiet presence, there was something dignified about him. A closer look revealed subtle but telling details: a faded military patch sewn onto his bag, dog tags hanging loosely around his neck, and the way his hands rested on his knees, calloused but steady. This man had once served his country, but life had clearly taken a turn. While many travelers passed by without a glance, a few noticed him, their expressions fleetingly softening before they moved on. For the most part, the man was left alone, a figure blending into the background. Seated a few rows away, a sharply dressed businessman barked into his phone, oblivious to the world around him. His suit was tailored to perfection, and his watch gleamed in the overhead lighting. He gestured animatedly as he spoke, his voice cutting through the surrounding chatter. "I don't care what excuse they're giving," he said, his tone dripping with irritation. "I need that contract finalized today. No delays." He paused, presumably listening to whoever was on the other end, before rolling his eyes and continuing. "Just get it done. This is unacceptable." As he ended the call, he leaned back in his chair and scanned the gate area. His gaze landed on the older man, and his lips curled into a sneer. "Airports should have better standards," he muttered to no one in particular. "Why let people like that loiter here? It's bad for business." The comment wasn't loud, but it carried enough force to reach the ears of those nearby. A young woman seated next to him glanced at the veteran and then quickly looked away, her face flushing. Another passenger shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The businessman smirked, apparently satisfied with his remark, and turned his attention to his phone again. In the far corner of the waiting area, another passenger observed the scene quietly. Barron Trump sat in a simple dark jacket and jeans, blending in as much as someone of his stature could. He had entered the terminal discreetly with his small security detail, ensuring minimal attention was drawn to him. Despite his unassuming appearance, there was an air of quiet confidence about him, a presence that naturally commanded respect without demanding it. Barron had chosen a seat away from the crowd, but his eyes missed nothing. He had noticed the older man as soon as he entered the gate area, the signs of military service catching his attention. The man's quiet dignity spoke volumes, even without words. Barron also noticed the businessman's disdainful remarks, the way they cut through the air with sharp precision, leaving a trail of discomfort in their wake. The veteran, for his part, didn't react. He sat motionless, his hands resting on his lap, his eyes downcast. But Barron could see the slight tightening of his shoulders, the almost imperceptible shift in his posture that betrayed the sting of the businessman's words. It was a scene Barron had witnessed too many times: people judging others based on appearances, dismissing their worth without a second thought. He clenched his jaw slightly, a flicker of frustration crossing his face, but he remained silent for now, content to observe. The businessman, meanwhile, continued his loud tirade, now speaking to a flight attendant who had approached to confirm his seating preference. "Is this flight going to be on time?" he asked, his tone curt. "I can't afford any delays." The attendant nodded politely. "We're on schedule, sir. Boarding will begin shortly." "Good," the man replied, leaning back in his chair with a sigh. "I've got important meetings in Seattle. Can't have anything throwing off my schedule." The flight attendant offered a professional smile before moving on, but her eyes flickered briefly to the veteran, her expression softening for just a moment. Barron caught the look and made a mental note of it. It was clear that while some chose to ignore or mock the older man, others recognized his quiet struggle, even if they didn't say anything aloud. As the gate agent announced priority boarding, the businessman stood up quickly, grabbing his sleek leather briefcase and heading toward the line. His eyes flickered toward the veteran again, and he muttered something under his breath, something Barron couldn't quite hear, but could guess wasn't kind. The older man remained seated, waiting for his group to be called, his duffel bag clutched tightly in his lap. Barron's gaze lingered on the veteran for a moment longer. He admired the man's restraint, his ability to maintain composure in the face of such blatant disrespect. But Barron also felt a simmering sense of injustice, a quiet determination beginning to form. He knew that staying silent wasn't an option. Not this time. As the boarding process continued, the scene at the gate remained a microcosm of society's broader struggles. Some people turned a blind eye to the businessman's behavior, unwilling to get involved. Others exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort evident but unspoken. And then there were those like Barron, who saw the moment for what it was, an opportunity to stand up for what was right, to remind people of the dignity and respect every individual deserved, regardless of their circumstances. Barron leaned back in his chair, his hands resting lightly on his knees. His security detail sat a few rows away, their expressions neutral but watchful. They wouldn't interfere unless necessary, and Barron appreciated their discretion. This was something he needed to handle himself. As the final boarding call was announced, Barron stood up slowly, stretching his tall frame. He glanced toward the businessman, who was already seated near the front of the plane, and then toward the veteran, who was now shuffling toward the gate with his bag slung over one shoulder. Barron's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression calm but resolute. He had a feeling this flight would be one to remember, not just for himself, but for everyone on board. The cabin had fallen into a strained silence, punctuated only by the low hum of the airplane's air conditioning and the occasional rustle of passengers settling into their seats. The businessman, reclining comfortably at the front of the plane, had returned to his phone, scrolling through emails with a smug expression. A few rows behind him, the veteran sat stiffly, his eyes fixed on the seat back in front of him, his weathered hands folded tightly on his lap. The humiliation he felt was unspoken but palpable. Toward the back of the plane, Barron Trump sat motionless, his sharp gaze shifting between the veteran and the businessman. The tension in the air was unmistakable, and the businessman's loud remarks still echoed in his mind. Barron's jaw tightened as he took in the veteran's slumped posture, the murmurs of discomfort from other passengers, and the way most people had chosen to look away rather than confront the injustice playing out before them. He couldn't stay silent any longer. Barron rose from his seat, his tall frame unfolding with deliberate purpose. The movement was slow but commanding, drawing immediate attention from those nearby. Heads turned and whispers spread as passengers recognized him. His presence had been quiet until now, but this was a moment that demanded action. Clearing his throat, Barron spoke in a voice that was calm but firm, cutting through the murmurs and idle chatter like a blade. "Excuse me," he began, his tone measured but unyielding. "I'd like to say something." The cabin fell silent. Even the businessman, who had been smirking moments earlier, looked up from his phone, his expression shifting to one of mild irritation. Passengers exchanged curious glances, unsure of what was about to happen, but unable to look away. Barron took a step forward, his hands resting lightly on the back of the seat in front of him. His blue eyes scanned the cabin, meeting the gazes of passengers one by one. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet intensity that demanded attention. "The man you're mocking," Barron began, his voice steady but carrying a weight that seemed to fill the cabin, "isn't just anyone. He's a veteran, someone who once fought for the freedoms you enjoy today." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. A few passengers looked down at their hands, ashamed. The businessman shifted in his seat, the smug confidence on his face faltering slightly. Barron continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "It's easy to judge someone based on appearances. It's easy to make assumptions about their worth or their story. But let me remind you of something. The man sitting there, quietly enduring your ridicule, has sacrificed more for this country than most of us ever will. The businessman's discomfort was becoming more apparent. He avoided Barron's gaze, staring out the window as if searching for an escape. The veteran, meanwhile, looked up for the first time, his tired eyes meeting Barron's. There was a flicker of surprise in his expression, followed by something deeper. Gratitude, perhaps, or relief. Barron's voice softened slightly, but the conviction in his tone remained. We live in a world where it's far too easy to look the other way, to let disrespect and cruelty go unchecked. But every one of us owes a debt to people like him. He didn't just serve this country, he gave a part of himself to protect it. And now in his time of need, he deserves our respect, not our scorn. The cabin was utterly silent. Even the flight attendants, who had been moving quietly through the aisles, paused to listen. A teenager near the window pulled out his earbuds, his expression thoughtful. A mother leaned down to whisper something to her child, who nodded solemnly. Barron took a deep breath, letting his words settle over the passengers. He could see the impact they were having, the way people were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier indifference replaced by a growing sense of shame and introspection. The businessman, once so loud and confident, now looked small and uneasy, his bravado stripped away by the weight of Barron's words. But Barron wasn't finished. He stepped into the aisle, walking with deliberate steps toward the veteran's row. The older man watched him with wide eyes, his hands gripping the armrests of his seat as if bracing himself for what was to come. Stopping in front of the veteran, Barron extended a hand. "Thank you for your service, sir," he said, his voice quieter now but no less heartfelt. The veteran hesitated for a moment, his gaze darting around the cabin as if unsure whether this was real. Slowly, he reached out and shook Barron's hand. His grip was firm despite the slight tremor in his fingers, and his eyes glistened with unspoken emotion. Barron released the veteran's hand and reached into his carry-on bag. From it, he pulled out a small American flag, carefully folded in a triangle. Holding it reverently, he placed it on the veteran's tray table, his movements deliberate and respectful. "This seat is yours," Barron said simply, his voice carrying an almost sacred finality. "And so is our respect." The gesture was small but profound. The flag, resting on the tray table, became a symbol that transcended words. It spoke of sacrifice, dignity, and the importance of honoring those who had given so much for others. It was a moment that would stay with everyone on that plane for a long time to come. The veteran looked down at the flag, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch it. He didn't speak. He couldn't. But the gratitude in his eyes said more than words ever could. Barron gave him a small nod, then stepped back, returning to his seat at the back of the plane. For a moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Then slowly, the ripple effect began. A man near the front of the plane stood up, placing his hand over his heart. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice rough with emotion. A teenage boy followed, standing awkwardly but with sincerity, his hand mimicking the gesture. One by one, passengers began to rise, some placing their hands over their hearts, others simply standing in silence. The businessman remained seated, his face pale, his earlier arrogance now replaced with visible discomfort. The flight attendants, visibly moved, exchanged glances and nodded in silent agreement. The cabin crew stopped what they were doing, standing tall in quiet respect for the veteran and for Barron's powerful gesture. Barron sat back in his seat, his expression calm but resolute. He wasn't looking for applause or recognition. That had never been his intention. What mattered was that he had said what needed to be said, and in doing so, he had reminded everyone on that plane of the power of respect and the importance of standing up for what was right. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the atmosphere in the cabin was completely transformed. The earlier tension and impatience had given way to a profound sense of unity, a shared understanding that went beyond words. It was a moment that none of them would forget, a moment that had started with one small act of honor. As Barron returned to his seat, the cabin remained utterly silent, the atmosphere thick with the weight of what had just transpired. The small American flag on the veteran's tray table seemed to radiate a quiet power, its presence commanding respect in a way that words never could. Barron sat down, his expression calm but resolute, his gaze fixed forward. He had said his piece, but the true impact of his actions was only beginning to unfold. For a moment it felt as if the entire plane was holding its breath. Then somewhere near the front of the cabin, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was hesitant at first, almost uncertain, but it broke the silence like a spark igniting dry tinder. Another passenger joined in, and then another until the sound of applause swelled throughout the cabin. It wasn't raucous or performative. There was a solemnity to it, an understanding that this was more than a gesture of approval. It was an acknowledgement of the truth Barron had spoken and the respect owed to the man who sat quietly in the middle row, his weathered hands resting gently on the flag before him. The veteran glanced around, his eyes wide and his posture stiff. He looked as though he wanted to disappear, unused to being the center of attention. But the applause didn't waver. If anything, it grew stronger, carrying with it the collective gratitude of the passengers. A few people nodded toward him, their expressions earnest. Near the front, the businessman, who had been the source of so much tension only minutes earlier, slouched in his seat. His confident smirk was long gone, replaced by a flushed face and darting eyes. He kept his gaze fixed firmly on the seat back in front of him, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. His earlier bravado had melted away, leaving only discomfort in its place. As the clapping subsided, a teenage boy seated by the window removed his earbuds. His hoodie was pulled low over his head, and he had spent most of the flight thus far in his own world, scrolling through his phone and nodding to the music only he could hear. But now he leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the veteran. "Hey," the boy said, his voice quiet but sincere. "Thanks for everything you've done." The veteran turned his head slowly, as if unsure whether the boy was speaking to him. When their eyes met, the older man gave a small, almost shy nod. "Thank you," he replied, his voice gruff but steady. A mother seated a few rows back leaned down to whisper to her young daughter, who had been watching everything unfold with wide, curious eyes. "That man is a veteran," the mother explained softly, pointing toward the veteran. "He's someone who served our country. That's why it's important to always show respect." The little girl nodded solemnly, her small hands clutching a stuffed animal. "Like a hero?" she asked, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those around her. "Exactly like a hero," the mother replied, her voice filled with pride. Even the flight attendants, who had been busy ensuring the plane was ready for takeoff, paused to take in the moment. One of them, a young woman with neatly tied hair and a name tag that read Maggie, made her way down the aisle toward the veteran. She knelt briefly beside his seat, her voice low but audible. "Thank you for your service, sir," she said, her tone warm and sincere. "It means more than you know." The veteran looked at her, his lips parting as though he wanted to say something, but no words came. Instead, he nodded, his hand briefly touching the edge of the flag on his tray table. Maggie smiled gently and stood, continuing her duties with a noticeable brightness in her expression. Throughout the cabin, the mood had shifted entirely. The earlier impatience, the undercurrent of tension and discontent, had been replaced by something deeper: introspection, gratitude, and even reverence. Passengers who had been staring at their phones or avoiding eye contact now sat straighter in their seats, their expressions thoughtful. Some whispered quietly to their neighbors, while others simply gazed out the windows, lost in their own reflections. The businessman, however, remained frozen in his seat. His discomfort was palpable, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. The earlier confidence with which he had mocked the veteran was gone, replaced by an awkward tension that seemed to radiate from him in waves. He glanced around the cabin, his face reddening as he realized just how isolated he had become. No one was meeting his gaze, not because they agreed with him, but because they were silently condemning his behavior. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, the businessman cleared his throat. The sound was sharp and jarring in the quiet cabin, drawing a few reluctant glances in his direction. I didn't mean anything by it," he stammered, his voice lacking the force it had carried earlier. "I mean, I wasn't trying to be disrespectful or anything." The apology, or what passed for one, fell flat. It hung in the air, hollow and insincere, failing to elicit any response from the passengers. The businessman fidgeted with his phone, his fingers tapping nervously against the screen as he tried to appear occupied. He looked toward the veteran, perhaps hoping for a gesture of forgiveness, but the older man didn't react. He remained focused on the flag before him, his expression unreadable. Barron, seated at the back of the plane, watched the scene unfold with a quiet intensity. He didn't speak, didn't react, but his presence alone was enough to keep the businessman from attempting any further justifications. Barron's earlier words still lingered in the cabin, their weight ensuring that no one could return to the indifference they had felt before. The veteran, for his part, seemed to have found a sense of peace. Though his posture was still guarded, there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a lightening of the weight he carried, if only slightly. The flag on his tray table remained untouched, a symbol of the respect he had earned and the gratitude that now surrounded him. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the ripple effects of Barron's stand continued to spread. Passengers who had once been strangers now shared knowing looks, their earlier impatience replaced by a shared sense of purpose. The businessman, silenced and subdued, stared out the window, his earlier arrogance now a distant memory. And the veteran, though still quiet, sat a little taller, his presence a reminder of the sacrifices made by so many who had served. What had started as a moment of cruelty and disrespect had transformed into something far greater, a lesson in humility, a call for gratitude, and a testament to the power of one voice speaking out against injustice. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and a quiet stillness filled the cabin. The earlier ripple of applause had faded into reflection, leaving the passengers to process the moment in their own way. Some stared out the windows, their faces pensive. Others sat in silence, their hands resting on their laps as if weighed down by the gravity of what they had just experienced. The businessman, now hunched over his phone, continued to avoid eye contact, his earlier bravado reduced to uneasy stillness. The veteran sat quietly in his middle seat, the small American flag resting prominently on the tray table before him. He hadn't spoken a word since Barron's gesture, but his posture had changed. His shoulders were no longer slumped, and there was a quiet dignity in the way he held himself. A voice crackled over the intercom, breaking the silence. It was the pilot. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone warm but firm, "I wanted to take a moment to thank you for your patience and understanding earlier. I know delays are never easy, but today we have someone very special aboard this flight." The passengers perked up, their attention drawn to the voice overhead. Even the businessman looked up briefly, his hand stilling over his phone. The veteran turned his head slightly, his brow furrowing as if uncertain about what was coming next. "We're honored to have a veteran traveling with us today," the pilot continued. "This individual has served our country with bravery and sacrifice, ensuring that we can enjoy the freedoms we often take for granted. It's moments like these that remind us of the importance of gratitude and respect for those who have given so much." A murmur spread through the cabin, soft and thoughtful. The pilot's words seemed to resonate deeply, carrying the weight of truth and reverence. "I'd like to ask everyone to join me in a brief moment of silence," the pilot said. "Let's take this time to reflect on the sacrifices made by all veterans, past and present, and to honor the service of those who have dedicated their lives to protecting our nation." The cabin fell silent. Heads bowed across the rows, and even those who had been restless earlier now stilled themselves. A mother gently guided her young child's hands into a prayer-like clasp, whispering softly into their ear. A teenager removed his earbuds, leaning forward with his hands resting on his knees. The flight attendants, standing quietly in the aisles, joined in as well, their hands clasped in front of them. The veteran remained still, his eyes fixed on the flag in front of him. His jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed as if he was holding back tears. He didn't move, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a sense of pride that filled the space around him. Beside him, the young woman in the aisle seat glanced over, her expression softening. She gave him a small nod, a silent gesture of respect. Barron, seated in the back, observed the moment quietly. His hands rested on his lap, his head slightly bowed. Though he didn't speak or move, his presence was steady, a silent pillar in the atmosphere of unity that had enveloped the plane. The transformation was undeniable. What had begun as a flight fraught with tension and impatience had become a collective moment of reflection, a shared acknowledgement of the sacrifices made by those who served. When the moment of silence ended, the cabin remained subdued. Passengers returned to their seats, but the air was different now, calmer, more respectful. The businessman shifted uncomfortably, glancing around at the other passengers as if searching for some cue to guide him. His earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by an awkward silence. The flight continued smoothly, and soon the captain announced their descent into Seattle. The city's lights sparkled below as the plane glided toward the runway, casting a warm glow through the cabin windows. Passengers began to gather their belongings, but when the plane touched down and rolled to a stop, no one rushed to stand. And the lead flight attendant's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we kindly ask that you remain seated for a few extra moments. We'd like to allow one of our passengers, a veteran, to disembark first." The passengers obeyed without hesitation, their earlier impatience completely absent. All eyes turned toward the veteran as he stood slowly, his movements deliberate and careful. He reached for his duffel bag, but a nearby passenger, a young man in his 20s, stood and retrieved it for him. "I've got it, sir," the young man said quietly, handing it to him with a respectful nod. The veteran hesitated, his eyes scanning the cabin as if unsure how to process the attention. Slowly, he began walking toward the exit, the flag still clutched in his hand. As he passed, passengers nodded and murmured their gratitude. "Thank you for your service," said an elderly woman near the front, her voice trembling with emotion. "God bless you," whispered another passenger, placing a hand over her heart. Even the businessman seated near the exit managed to mutter a quiet, "I'm sorry," as the veteran walked by. His apology was weak, but the effort was there, and for a moment, the veteran paused. He gave the businessman a brief nod before continuing down the aisle. And Barron watched the scene unfold from his seat in the back, his expression calm but thoughtful. He waited until the veteran had exited before standing and collecting his own belongings. His security detail fell into step behind him as he made his way toward the exit. Outside the terminal, the night air was cool and crisp. A small group of people waited near the gate, their eyes scanning the crowd. As the veteran emerged, they stepped forward, a group of fellow veterans, their uniforms crisp and their postures straight. One of them stepped forward and saluted, a gesture filled with unspoken respect. The veteran froze for a moment, his eyes widening. Slowly, he raised his hand and returned the salute, his movements precise despite his weariness. The two men exchanged a brief nod, and then the group surrounded the veteran, clapping him on the shoulder and exchanging quiet words of welcome. Barron stood at a distance, watching the scene unfold. He didn't approach. This moment wasn't his to share. Instead, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. He had done what he could, and now the veteran was surrounded by those who understood him best. As Barron turned to leave, he glanced back one last time. The veteran was standing taller now, his earlier weariness replaced by a sense of belonging. The flag was still in his hand, its colors vivid under the terminal lights. Barron took a deep breath, his expression calm but resolute, and walked away, leaving behind a moment of unity that would stay with everyone who had witnessed it. The story concludes with a powerful reminder. Small acts of respect and kindness have the ability to create a ripple effect, transforming the dynamics of an entire group. Even the quietest gestures can challenge negativity and open doors for change. In this way, the narrative highlights how standing up for what's right, especially in uncomfortable moments, not only supports individuals, but strengthens communities. By choosing to act with dignity and empathy, we acknowledge the importance of honoring those who have sacrificed for the greater good. This story is a call to reflect on our own actions and consider how we can contribute to making the world a more respectful, just place.